People coming in. Hi, everyone. I'm Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward. We're going to give people a minute or so to roll in here. We're excited that you've joined us on this auspicious night of the second and final presidential debate to hear about the many varied ways that disinformation is really threatening our democracy this year. We have an amazing panel. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. But before I do, I want to thank especially Lori Moskowitz and Stacy Burdett, who have helped us so much in putting this program together and in creating a partnership with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue that has helped us to focus our coverage on disinformation in the last few weeks. Again, for those who are just joining us, I'm Jodi Rudoren, editor-in-chief of The Forward. We have this amazing panel of experts who are really going to help us parse through some of the disinformation and information about disinformation that we've all been inundated with this election season. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're going to have a real conversation with them. And we certainly want to include your questions and comments. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. You'll find that button on the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, and on the left if you're on a phone or a tablet. And if you have a comment that you'd like to make to the group, but not a question for the panel, you can use the chat function. Just make sure you're chatting to all panelists and attendees. And just one more bit of logistics to say we will be emailing you. Everybody who's here, everybody who registered and couldn't make it, will get a video of this conversation, all the links that we put in the chat, and some highlights. So don't worry if you miss anything, you'll be able to catch up real soon. So I want to welcome today our great panel. We have Angelo Carusone, who's the president and CEO of Media Matters. Media Matters is sort of the go-to resource for journalists like me on disinformation and other topics. He's an expert on right-wing extremism and a sometimes DNC operative who got famous for launching the viral Dump Trump campaign in 2012 that helped convince Macy's to end its business partnership with Donald Trump. He's been involved in all sorts of campaigns, reads everything, and will really be helpful in guiding us tonight. We also have Lisa Kaplan, who's the CEO of the Alethea Group. She founded that consultancy to help build resiliency against disinformation through research, analysis, education, and crisis communications. Lisa's a veteran of campaigns and worked on the Hill. She was the digital director for Senator Angus King's campaign in Maine, and in that campaign had to offense and defense, a strategy for fighting disinformation in real time. And then we have Oren Segal, who's vice president of the ADL's Center on Extremism. He has been with the ADL since 1998. The ADL, as most of you know, is one of the most rigorous trackers of hate speech and disinformation online. Oren's work has been relied on by law enforcement all over the world to help literally stop terrorism. Other important parts of his bio include that our children are in the same religious school class, and he was on our Forward 50 last year list of influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews. And finally, my colleague Molly Boigon, who is an investigative reporter at The Forward, and who for the last several weeks has been really digging into disinformation and anchoring our new newsletter, Fahrenheit 411, which she also came up with that adorable name, which is working with the ISD to really track hate speech and disinformation as it relates to the Jewish community and anti-Semitism through this campaign. So thank you again for being here. We're going to try to keep this conversation lively. We have a lot of smart, insightful people here, so I'm going to try to get right to it. I want to, as I said, just trying to even just prepare for tonight, I feel really inundated. And I think a lot of people are totally overwhelmed with both the amount of disinformation and the amount of coverage of disinformation. It seems like we are at some kind of real nadir of disinformation coming from shady online groups like QAnon, from other countries like Iran and Russia trying to interfere in our elections, from interest groups that are running nefarious advertisements, as I said, from sort of local news sites that aren't really news sites, sometimes from the White House itself. And there was a recent poll from the Knight Foundation saying 4 out of 5 Americans believe that misinformation is going to impact this election. And I guess I would love each of you to quickly talk about, is it as bad as it seems? Is it the worst ever? How bad is it? Give me a quick round on that. Why don't we start with Oren?
Thanks, Jodi. Good to be here. Thank you, and great to be to share the Zoom with these panelists. I've not been on Zoom at all for like the last couple of weeks, so this is a real treat. But I will say that
we'll have to delve into that, how you've possibly not been on Zoom, but okay.
Yes, see, that was my effect at disinformation from the get-go. So,
oh, I see. That was sarcasm.
So I think when the question was, is it as bad as ever? And I think what's different now is the way that people are communicating, right? I don't need to sort of totally state the obvious, but I spend more time on my phone and on my computer, and not just because of the pandemic, but that's the way that we are accessing information, hanging out with our friends, et cetera. And so to the degree that, nefarious characters, whether they're extremists or foreign entities, are always going to try to leverage the latest technology, it's no surprise that, a lot of the effort to win hearts and minds is happening online. And by the way, disinformation is not just, somebody who's trying to trick you to vote in a different way. I mean, it's about how to, make you buy something that you don't want. So I think like disinformation takes a whole different bunch of, it presents itself in different ways. And I'll focus hopefully in this call really on the way extremists are doing it, because that's what I know best.
Okay, great. How about you, Angelo? You've been obviously in this biz for a while. How bad is it?
I mean, it's really bad, obviously, but I think, there's just, it is, if you, by every measurable indicator, the saturation of disinformation has increased. And when we talk about disinformation, at least from my perspective, what we mean is, it's a kind of misinformation. It's a misinformation that has a purpose and an intent, which means that it's not the same as just fact checking something, right? Because oftentimes there's a piece of misinformation that you can correct, and some people will believe it and most people may not, but the point is that it exists. But when it's disinformation, there's an intent and a vector, so that it's going to constantly adapt in order to sort of reach a landing zone, which is to either change your behavior or, as Oren was pointing out, to influence your conduct in some meaningful way. So the rise of disinformation is worse than ever for sure, especially in the current atomized landscape that has had the effect of increasing extremism. And also it's made it a lot harder to track and to follow. So there's no doubt about that, and there's plenty of data to back that up. The one thing that I would say that's really different though, and it's just a reflection of this call and just generally, is that if you compare this moment in time to the same moment in time 4 years ago, there's other things that are better too. And I'm not an optimist by nature. I'm actually a super big pessimist. So I'm about to say something that it sounds much more, a little off brand for me. And that's that, if you look back at 2016, one of the effects of disinformation, misinformation, and the extremism that comes from is that it influences behavior in terms of what you're willing to say. At that point in time, nearly 50% of Americans that identified as left of center did not engage with content publicly related to politics or civic engagement. That number was only 8% on the right. And the reason why 1 out of every 2 people on the left, according to Pew, were sort of muting these conversations is not because they didn't care, it's because they didn't want to deal with the blowback of being trolled, harassed, or abused. So the net effect of years of this change had actually affected people's behavior, where they started to do the very natural duck and cover. That phenomenon has decreased a little bit in recent time, I think in part because more awareness has sort of come to pass. And it's also, I think, affected what people think about and expect in terms of the platforms and also news media. They're thinking a little bit more about media literacy, even if that hasn't broadly increased as a whole. So what I would say is that the problem is worse than ever, sort of like a virus out of control. We all know about that. But there's progress toward building a lot more antibodies in the community as well. And I think these conversations, others actually put us in a better place to grapple with it, as opposed to just putting our heads in the sand and sort of wishing it to go away or just dealing with the consequences. So worse than ever, super scary, but we're actually at a pivotal moment right now. And there are some indicators that are improving.
Great analogy, very timely. We'll ask later if there's a vaccine on the horizon, but I want to underscore what I think I heard you say, Angelo, make sure, Lisa, that I got this right. The best way to define the simplest thing, misinformation is stuff that's not true, not backed up, and disinformation is what people are willfully trying to manipulate you for a particular agenda. Is that the right way to distinguish them? Lisa, why don't you take that? And
yeah, that's absolutely right. But I will say that the two are linked. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that these bad actors who are trying to spread falsehoods in order to get you to take an action, these aren't just bloggers who are writing for the fun of it. They are malicious actors who are executing well thought out plans in order to influence your behavior, are also relying on people to unknowingly be part of their disinformation campaign. And that has to do with the algorithmic silos in which we live and who we trust. So going back to, how has disinformation changed? Has it gotten worse? To me, the answer is unfortunately a resounding yes. A lot of that has to do with the fact that it is so cheap and easy to launch a disinformation campaign. What the Russians did in 2016 cost about $1 million. And when you think about it from a military budget perspective, that's a rounding error. And so when you take that into consideration, and we now know that we have over 70 countries who are engaging in this, that doesn't include, unethical political operatives. It doesn't include for-profit disinformation outfits who are starting to pop up and solely exist to be able to sell influence. It really is the Wild West out there, and it's helpful to have that knowledge of who is in this space, who are the bad actors, because then you can start to do things like understand their motives and predict their behavior. We do a lot of wargaming around that to try to understand the motive so that it's easier for us to quickly identify instances of disinformation and misinformation as well. I'm also a pessimist about this situation, unfortunately. However, there are definitely some silver linings. So just to build a little bit off of what Angelo was saying, in 2016, disinformation wasn't a word that we used very often. It wasn't. A bot was a new term. Now there's greater understanding thanks to the work of folks like Media Matters, First Draft News, Newslet Project. There's greater understanding and awareness of these issues. People know what a deepfake is before we've seen one really deployed in a meaningful way in the political arena. So there are some silver linings because we don't have to then explain this is a deepfake. This is what a deepfake is. We can just say this is a deepfake. So I do think that we are working towards society-wide resiliency. And I do think that we will ultimately see some of the systemic reforms that we need in order to make it harder to have a disinformation campaign be effective, but we're not there yet. And so right now, because a lot of organizations have abdicated responsibility, we've been relying on a lot of organizations to step up. And there have been some really amazing programs that have come out of that to be able to help solve this challenge. And I am optimistic that this is a solvable problem. We can do things that are challenging. We can put men on the moon. So I think we can take this one down too. But I do think we do have a couple of years to go. We're not going to be out of the woods after this election. And we're going to continue to see disinformation continue to be propagated for different reasons, depending on the threat actor's goal.
Molly, I'm interested in where you sit on this as a journalist, both sort of covering the topic, but also, constantly when you're writing about politics or other things, like having to guard against picking up something that's not true or that's faked or that's manipulative, attempting to manipulate. Like, how do you, it's like when I was coming up, they said in journalism class, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. But this feels like a new level of really not being able to trust anything you see. So how do you function?
Yeah, covering this issue has made me alert to the possibility, to the fact really that all of us have been exposed to narratives of disinformation. It's not just a single fact. It's a curated kind of stream of misinformation that sort of falls under a certain category or evokes a certain fear. So I've definitely been aware, especially because as journalists, and especially during the pandemic, we spent so much time online combing social media sites for story ideas. I've just been really trying to be aware of when I see a story, when a storyline starts to emerge in my own mind, of whether that's been planted there by a bad actor or whether it's something that I've actually deduced. Another thing I wanted to say about whether disinformation is worse now than it has been is that, in addition to all the factors everyone else mentioned, this seems like a moment where bad actors have won the lottery. We have a global pandemic, which is just ripe with opportunities to plant misinformation about vaccines, about public health information, about the legitimacy of prevention measures like masks. In the United States, we have an ongoing reckoning with systemic racism, which has been used to pit Americans against each other, and we have an election. So it just, in addition to all of the other factors, it feels like the kind of perfect storm for disinformation agents to target Americans and divide us.
Yeah, I mean, and we have this world filled with tools that are easy to manipulate. And I guess that's sort of what I mean, I'm not sure this is an answerable question, so I'm not sure I should ask it, but I feel like as I'm thinking about what you're saying, I'm just want to know, like, I feel like some historian later is going to have to assess whether there were actually more bad actors now or just systems that made it easier for them to get exposure. And I mean, I don't know, is that a question worth exploring, or is it kind of who knows and who cares? Because the truth is we're wallowing in bad actors with easy tools now, and it's scary.
Well, like Lisa said, there are bad actors, and then there are kind of their unwitting agents, people who are exposed to disinformation and who don't have the tools to kind of parse it. And yeah, I think, I mean, you used to have to print a flyer and distribute it in order to make people think a certain thing. There was an overhead cost associated with that. And again, disinformation is exceedingly cheap, and it pretty much, once the content is out there, it amplifies itself by design.
I just want to remind everyone in the audience, because I've got people who are using the chat to ask questions or chatting just to the panelists. So here's the way this is going to work. If you want to make a comment to everyone, go ahead and do it in the chat, but make sure you hit all panelists and attendees. Okay. And if you have a question that you want me to ask the panelists, please do not put it in the chat, but put it in the Q&A. I'm sorry to have so many rules, but those are the rules. So try to follow them and it'll help the conversation go more smoothly. I want to ask about, again, you guys are living this, you all have years of experience, and we all know we expected this election to be bad. Molly just laid out some of the specific reasons why there's so much going on. But what's the thing that's been in the last few days or weeks that you've seen, maybe a specific instance that you're really a little surprised by, or that you're most worried about, that feels the most nefarious, whether it's because of the targeting, because of the mechanism? I don't know. I'd love each of you to share one example that you can teach us about.
I'm happy to start. So many of you probably saw, 2 days ago, it really started this concept that the Proud Boys, right? This group that got name checked by the president not too long ago, apparently was sending out emails threatening people in Florida, Pennsylvania, in Alaska. So that's sort of been a clue, number one, that maybe it wasn't necessarily what it seemed to be. But then what happened was this sort of believability, right? Of course, it's an extremist group that believes in violence. Of course, they would threaten people. And basically the threats were, if you don't vote Republican, you don't vote for Trump, we're going to come after you. Now, for us who are tracking extremists all the time, immediately seemed unbelievable. That's not the MO of the Proud Boys. And yet we started getting, through our 25 regional offices, I'm scared, what am I going to do? And so mission accomplished, whoever was going to do that, to create fear and anxiety in a time of an election. Then slowly, as people were investigating this, authorities, good journalism, right? We saw that maybe it's connected to Estonia. Then there was a hastily put together press conference where maybe Iran and Russia are actually responsible for it. But here's the deal. Here's sort of the lasting thing why this is important. As we've been tracking extremist threats to the election, I've always been saying the biggest place where people may feel intimidated or not safe is here. Before they even go out and see somebody allegedly showing up with their weapons, they're going to get, blasted with all this fear and anxiety on their phone about why they shouldn't do that. And the enemies or people who want to create chaos or have an agenda can take, part in that so easily. Lisa, you said that, we put man on the moon. Well, I also know that my subway is delayed when it rains. And so we're pretty good at doing things, but I'm not so sure we are prepared for the volume of misinformation that we're literally sitting on now.
And I agree, we're not prepared. I think that it's really unfortunate. A lot of the mechanisms that have been put in place to allegedly protect us against disinformation have all come at the 11th hour. The decisions by the platforms, even when it comes to things, and the ADL has done a ton of work on this to get Holocaust denialism off of platforms. When you think about every major conspiracy theory, ranging from QAnon having a deep state run by George Soros to whatever it is, there is usually an underlying tinge of anti-Semitism. So these threats have been allowed to fester, and there are just now so many of them that the question is, where do you start? And so, going back to what Oren was talking about in terms of election-related violence and these militia groups, and the ADL is doing some great work as well with training state and local governments, state attorneys general. We are seeing, foreign actors amplifying those narratives. Not everybody realizes that RT and Sputnik and all of these Russian state media outlets are actually state media outlets. Again, labeling has gotten better, but there are now Americans who trust those sources as authorities of accurate information. And the top narratives that they are pushing are things like there will be election-related violence, things like the US will be politically unstable. All of these narratives, and they all have a kernel of truth because of these sorts of events, because there was a kidnapping attempt on a governor, because we've seen, armed individuals recruited to be poll watchers. And what's unfortunate is that because of the information environment that we live in, it's created a dangerous situation where, to Oren's point, fear will be instilled before an action even happens.
Right.
Yeah, that reminds me of an article that I read in The Atlantic this week about how QAnon believers and, orchestrators of QAnon conspiracy have basically set themselves up for success no matter whether Biden wins the presidential election or Trump wins the presidential election, because this whole theory about a deep state and the, that the government is run by people, a secret shadow government, it can be applied to either scenario. So that's probably the most disturbing thing that I've seen in recent history.
For me, the most recent thing, and it's sort of like a disinformation sandwich, is that we tracked 1,000 individual instances of recruitment to be poll watching just in the last 10 days, to poll watchers or election judges within the QAnon community and a few other militias, but primarily the QAnon communities. That's a lot in 10 days. And the reason I called it a disinformation sandwich is two reasons. One, on the front end, one of the things that often preceded that call to action was a sort of an overhyped piece of misinformation or disinformation, which is that, a bunch of ballots were driven into a ditch, not true, in Wisconsin, right? A bunch of ballots were stolen in Maryland, not true. But these false stories get hyped, they saturate, and that false narrative then inspires and incentivizes the call to action. You then have to go become a poll watcher to protect against Democrats or people stealing the election. And then on the back end of it, what concerns me about that is that when people are worried about the results, there's a lack of civic understanding about how vote by mail works and when you can even start to count the votes and what to expect. But one thing that makes people feel immediately better is when you start to inform them about the process. When you tell people that there's actually election judges in the rooms while the votes are being counted, they feel better. It actually inspires confidence, and they should have confidence. The problem with that is, imagine a scenario where these polls and the vote counting is now flooded with all of these QAnon conspiracists. You can imagine how immediately after, while the votes are being counted, you have this cauldron of potential lies that can easily be spread about, I saw this, they stole ballots there, they were throwing away Republican ballots here. That's where it starts to become a real concern. So what started from disinformation led to a very concrete surge in action and recruitment, which then in turn could lead to a much more, in this case, even further credible, even though they're false, but it adds more credibility to that of disinformation after the election. So that's the thing that's really scaring me.
I want to go more into QAnon because I imagine we'll hear some more about that later tonight. But I first have what I think, I fear this is a dumb question, but whatever. They gave me the microphone, right? So, which is, I was thinking as you were talking about, the fear around election fraud, whatever. I remember a couple of weeks ago, I forget what I was watching, but I heard somebody say really clearly, like there's been 154 instances of election fraud, like in the history with some huge denominator. I forget how many, it's a tiny number, right? And I was like, oh, well, that makes me feel a lot better. And I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, how come the good actors, including, by the way, mainstream media companies like the one I used to work for 21 years, that has a pretty big microphone, the New York Times, but why can't they why is disinformation drowning out good information? If it's true that there's only been 154 cases of fraud in the history of elections or whatever that fact was, which I'm probably misquoting a little bit, but it's really reassuring. And why can't it get amplified as loudly as the conspiracy theory about the poll watchers?
So a lot of, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. No, please, go ahead.
So a lot of it has to do with the algorithms, frankly. We live in these algorithmic silos, and we have to think about the context in which we're operating. So it's not you pick up a newspaper and the news that's fit to print is all on the front page. You then read that, you at least know what you need to know. Hopefully you get to section B, but we'll see. And so instead what happens is we're each have our own algorithm, all of us. So I don't see the same thing that any of the panelists see necessarily. And we're probably all in similar algorithmic silos because we work on these issues. And so think about your own Facebook feed, your own Twitter feed for a second. The information that you see, what's shown to you in your feeds, it is curated to you based on what you've liked, based on who you're friends with, based on what you're reading when you're not even on the platforms. There's always the creepy, I just got an Instagram ad for Wayfair because I left something in my cart sort of situation. That's what bad actors are doing too. And because disinformation feeds into our biases, which the social media companies have created little tiny digital universes for us based on our biases, it works. It's like the junk food of information. We may know it's fake, but we want to read it. We want to click on it. And when we engage with that content, it then gets further amplified within the algorithm so that our communities see it. Facts are less fun. They're less shareable, that sort of thing. It's funnier to share a meme or to click on it and see what it says versus a statistic. It's one of the reasons why fact checking is not always the best or most effective antidote to a disinformation narrative. It's not always a one-for-one. It's a part of a solution, but it's not always the whole solution. What this means, though, is that there are actually things you can do to slow the spread of disinformation. So if you see something that might be false, don't share it. If you see something that you're not sure about, don't click on it. And those are some of the little things that you can do, as well as deliberately search outside your own algorithm to see what's being said.
That's great advice.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Because I think sometimes when we think of disinformation, it's almost like someone's randomly walking around, they have their beliefs, they see something and they change their worldview at the drop of a hat, which is not clearly what is being talked about here. Where I almost feel like we need to also keep in mind, and I see this with extremists in particular, that there's like this prepping or tenderizing that happens beforehand. So if you're in the middle of an election campaign where misogyny and anti-immigrant rhetoric and Islamophobia becomes like a normal narrative, and believing ideas about those communities that are just like completely false, by the time QAnon comes around, and these are like intense fantasies and absurd, you're going to be a little more sort of willing to make that jump because you've been prepped. And so I viewed sort of disinformation as not sort of this one moment in time, but something that sort of has evolved. And that's the slow roll. That's how they get you to believe. And that's a tactic extremists have been using for years.
I mean, I have to say, I kept having to sort of pinch myself last week when we're watching, was it NBC or whatever, the mainstream network, and the President of the United States talking about QAnon. And what he's saying is that they are like, really anti-pedophilia, as though that's some kind of unusual position, and they're really on a campaign to get pedophilia out of the whatever. It was like, I found myself, I thought I was like living in some alternate reality, which I guess a lot of us have been feeling a lot of the time.
Sorry, I just on that, Jodi.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I also think an important part of this is that, many people covering the president and the Trump administration have struggled to kind of deal with that type of disinformation coming from this administration. And also just another like kind of stroke of luck thing that I talked about with Angelo, shortly after, that QAnon coverage and interest and chatter about QAnon increased exponentially after Jeffrey Epstein's death and after arrests in that case, which was just, again, a stroke of luck because the QAnon conspiracy theory relies so heavily on another related to child sex trafficking. So that was just another kind of
and to Lisa's point, every time that happens and that's mentioned, that powers that algorithm, right? So it's like,
and if there's a number on that. If you look at growth rates on Facebook in particular, and this is where some of the algorithms, we talk about them in the abstract, but there are decision makers behind those algorithms. There are people who are making choices. And when we analyze not just the reach of content, but also the communities. And if you look at the growth rates for news sites, they've had a 0.6% growth rate on Facebook between June and September. The left-leaning
talking about views, engagement, whatever.
That's just total, like the overall size of their growth. So the size of the community's growth. And the left-leaning communities had about a 1%, right-leaning had about a 2.5%. Reopen groups had about a 7%, anti-vax 20. QAnon,
sorry, what's reopen is like reopen instead of coronavirus?
Like the economy, and sort of any of the lockdowns. The QAnon community over that same 3-month period had a 26% growth rate. And we know from Facebook's own internal reporting that the majority of growth comes from Facebook's own recommendations, which means that their own engine was responding and prioritizing those moments. So maybe all these other factors and things people were seeing and all this profile that they develop on people was sort of zeroing in on the kinds of people likely to subscribe to or potentially adhere to those ideas and promoting that content directly to them so that they would in turn be not just consume it, but then follow it over time. They actually sort of subscribe to it.
Angelo, just to contextualize that a little bit, some of those things you mentioned that had huge growth are having huge growth because they were small. I mean, anti-vax groups is relatively new compared to all the media sites on Facebook who've been building and growing for 20 years, right? So
I mean, the reopen would be an example of that. And if you notice, anti-vax had only a 7% growth rate, but they've been long established.
Right. But reopen and even QAnon, right? We're talking about a smaller base. So
well, I mean, QAnon's been on Facebook predominantly for 3 years, and their growth rates had been pretty steady and consistent.
And then just spiked up.
That's right. And that's a change, right? And that doesn't mean, so the question is not just, are they engineering it? But I think the bigger question is, what do they do when they see that change, right? Are they making the same thing with Google, right? I mean, when you search for certain results, you don't expect Holocaust denial to be at the top of the Google page because you expect them to weight the source. And that's just something we've come to accept. In the case of Facebook and some of the other platforms, there's really a question of when they see these spikes and changes, what are they doing to adjust their own algorithm so it's not creating this intensification feedback loop?
I definitely want to get very quickly soon into the platform's responsibility and what some of the recent announcements of what they're trying to do, what you guys think of them. But before we do that, I want to just, we obviously are a Jewish publication and we have a largely Jewish audience. And I just want to ask you guys to contextualize for us. I feel like most of us as Jewish journalists and our audience probably hear more about, think more about, focus more on the ways in which everything we're talking about touches anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and, attacks on Jews or anti-Semitic tropes. But can you help us put into context of like where Jews fit into the broader kind of family of disinformation campaigns. If you were looking at this objectively, are we like a big part of this landscape that deserves all this extra attention, or is it much worse for other communities, other issues, etc.? I don't know. Oren, are you the person? Maybe Oren, are you in our bubble, or you have both, right?
I mean, sure. I'll defer to Lisa in a second. I just wanted to say the anti-Semitism is the original disinformation, and so when you look at conspiracy theories of any kind, right, they sort of have these little nuggets that they know they're going to attract people based on, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, kind of everything we're dealing with right now. And then they sort of take you to the next level of belief because you have nothing else to believe. And that's what Jews have been dealing with forever. And in fact, like conspiracy theories are the lifeblood of extremist movements writ large. Like when you think about, why are extremist movements extreme? It's because their belief systems are literally out of the sort of the norm. And we don't have to get into a whole sort of definitional argument. But this is sort of tried and true. This is practice. Angelo mentioned reopen protests. Well, reopen protests were practice for militias right now. And, anti-Semitism in the past has been practice for conspiracy theories that we're seeing today. Now, we have to be careful because we don't want to take ownership of everything, and so it's not that every conspiracy theory is anti-Semitic or inherently anti-Semitic, but I will tell you, it's a few degrees away from anti-Semitism if we're really being honest.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Oren. That's really helpful. And I'm now looking at some of the audience questions, and they're great, so I want to get to them quickly. So let's first, though, I would love to hear, TikTok just this week banned various forms of hate speech. Facebook a few weeks ago banned Holocaust denial. I think there's probably 6 other examples that I'm less facile with than all of you. But starting with, why don't you guys each just say, do you think? I mean, are they finally waking up and doing enough? Should we? What do we think about how the platforms are being held accountable or not for helping us control this?
Oh boy, that's tough. I mean, it's always hard. Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that they are doing things. It will bring the temperature down maybe a degree or two in some cases. And some things they've done already that are really significant. It was last year that they put in place policies to prevent manipulated media and deepfakes. There's a reason why we're not talking about that right now as a crisis we're dealing with, is because they were intentional and proactive. So I would point out, one, policies can work when they think about them and they put them in place at appropriate time. A lot of the policies, just to sum it up right now, are extraordinarily reactive. And these kinds of things, it's good that they're happening, but they're mitigation efforts. And really the best way to deal with disinformation, misinformation, and the pipeline to extremism is promote proactive, preventative approach. So most of the things we're seeing now, they are going to bring the temperature down, but they're not really designed to prevent a lot of the worst abuses that are in front of us. So good, but we want and need a lot more of the proactive thinking that we saw last year in a very, very limited sense, like around deepfakes, because that's where the difference maker really is.
Molly, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've heard from every expert that I've talked to is that Facebook is notoriously bad at enforcement. So while they've come forward with these announcements, it remains to be seen if they'll actually act and enforce the terms and conditions they promised to users. And I totally forgot the second thing I was going to say.
That's okay. Lisa's got something to say.
So I think to Molly's point and to Angelo's point, I am always skeptical when the platforms roll out a new policy as to whether or not it's actually enforceable. And, we talk a lot about Facebook, as we should, because it is a huge problem when it comes to disinformation because of the groups, the algorithms, the events it's designed to be able to organize. YouTube has a huge problem as well. We talk about it less, frankly, because it's harder to analyze at scale because it's video. And we just don't have the tools to be able to do it in a meaningful way yet. Or if we do, they're incredibly expensive. And so a couple of thoughts, and just, what this means is that these policies may get rolled out, but they're not enforceable at scale. And groups that are already well organized are going to find a way to get around them. And frankly, they're not consistent across platforms. So just because these, so for example, with QAnon, it was allowed to fester on Facebook, it was allowed to fester on Twitter. Some of it may have been taken off, but guess what? They're on Gab now. They're on Parler. They're on wherever else they are, because new technologies can get created and they have even fewer enforcement mechanisms.
We have a bunch of questions that I'm going to use or surface in a minute about what individuals can do to sort of be good citizens in this environment. But first, I want to do a little more on QAnon because we have a few questions about that. The first one from Barry Woolner, he said he had seen on CNN, they were interviewing people who believe in QAnon conspiracy theories. And I think the New York Times just had a pretty extensive article too, visiting in Georgia, where there's a congressional candidate who's deep into QAnon. The interviewer, Barry says, was surprised at the number of people who said they believed in these theories, even though they seem so crazy. And how do we, what's our estimate of like how many people believe QAnon's conspiracy theories? Is there any way to know that?
I mean, we have an operating one, which is, we've estimated this roughly the size of just like adherents, people that are really at the center of it. We put somewhere in the range of like the 18 to 30 million range. And that's just based off of sheer consumption. And then the ratios of some of the shows that they've had. I mean, I would just emphasize for the audience
18
that
to 30 million people you think have done
right.
what? Have like touched
that not haven't touched it, that are full on adherents to it or subscribers to the philosophy of QAnon in some significant way. Just for context, I mean, there were over 80 candidates that ran during the primaries, 26 are on the ballot in November that are full QAnon adherents. But if you just want,
sorry, is that in the country or in the world?
No, the country. I'm just talking about the states. And just to illustrate why that number is not so crazy, even though it sounds it, is, QAnon for a while, although this started been shut down, they had shows like, the way that you would watch cable news or other TV shows. They had shows on YouTube, multiple, but they had shows on YouTube that eclipsed CNN's ratings and MSNBC's ratings. And in terms of just sheer size, in order to get an audience, multiple audience of that size, that would, unless they're more than 2 million, right? That's your baseline. It's not like every single one of them is watching live in the moment. So, that's the rough number that we've been playing with based off of indicia like that. So what's the size of their media consumption? And then what can you extrapolate based on behaviors to say, okay, here's what the universe of adherence would look like. But the number of people that are sympathetic to it is probably 30% of the country when you dig down to most of the polling.
Okay, this is not making me feel better, Angelo.
Sorry.
Can I just say, so Angelo just gave some data, and I'm gonna sort of go the other way and give an anecdote that I think also tells this story.
Great.
So I've been looking at conspiracy theories and of hatred for 20 something years, New World Order, whatever it is. I've never had acquaintances, friends of friends kind of get in touch with me and say, my so-and-so loved one, whatever it is deep into this. What do I do to get them out? Maybe one here or there. I've never had sort of consistently people that I work with sort of in other places, don't know that well, but are so desperate because they're looking for an answer because somebody has gone down that rabbit hole and has stayed down that rabbit hole.
So what is the answer, Oren? What is the answer when somebody calls you and says, what do I do to get Uncle Joe to stop believing this?
So, I mean, I talk about, there are sort of proactive ways that aren't going to help Uncle Joe, but it's sort of holding these platforms accountable, which is what we were just talking about. My answer to that is, and maybe this is not intended to be too hyperbolic, you don't stick a knife into someone's back 6 inches, pull it out 3 and call it progress. We need to demand that these platforms do even more so that Uncle Joe has a fighting chance, right, to even have an alternative view. But if Uncle Joe's already down that rabbit hole, or more likely, cousin, Leo or whatever, then, I mean, listen, there are some organizations that do outreach, and I'm seeing that like former extremists whose jobs are to sort of for the years have been like through social work and mental health, get people out of extremist movements. Now they're focusing on conspiracy. But I'll tell you, it's a little harder now to tell the difference between somebody who supports QAnon and Uncle Joe, where it used to be easy if they were sort of a neo-Nazi or extremist.
And just to add to that, I think one of the things we have to really unpack is what makes QAnon so attractive to people. It's different than other conspiracies and violent extremist groups. When we think about everything that we went through with ISIS, for example, there was structure, there was command control. Yes, they were using disinformation and social media manipulation to recruit people. But QAnon is different. And QAnon is different because it's the choose your own adventure of conspiracy theories. It's very much, you may feel like you've been left behind. You may feel like you're alienated from society. And QAnon is giving you a way to be able to feel like you belong to something. So there's that component, but it also is very vague in what it does. So it'll say things that frankly don't really make sense. It encourages users to go out and find their own evidence, to do their own investigations. And when you're saying go find your own evidence with vague references to everybody from Tom Hanks to John Brennan, it's really tough to combat that. And it's really easy for people who are desperate to be able to identify with it. And so that's one of the things that I think we have to consider as well when it comes to both understanding why are these numbers? And I am not at all surprised by the numbers that Angelo has cited. I think it's amazing you guys were able to come up with that in a scientific way. But why are those numbers so big? That's why. But it's also going to need to inform, how do we get out of this mess?
Also, I think we've all, every panelist has mentioned this, but it deserves to be underscored that the growth of QAnon can be traced to the amplification of groups and pages by Facebook's algorithm. It used to be a fairly small movement that, grew exponentially because Facebook itself was recommending pages and groups to people who had been interested in other kind of fringe conspiracy theory movements. And also, just to what Lisa was saying, it really is a choose your own adventure in multiple ways, and that it targets different vulnerabilities, but also that there are different degrees of QAnon. Some people believe in the vague idea of a deep state or a shadow government, and then other people believe that politicians are injecting themselves with chemicals. So there's a full range of belief that can capture people all along the scale of indoctrination. It really is.
So I think you guys have actually sort of already answered the question I'm about to ask, but I think it's important to ask it because Charles Manjarian asked it, and it belies or portrays some skepticism that I think is important to surface. So he's asking, he pointed it at you, Lisa, so I'll let you start. Says, agreed that QAnon is crazy. Why should we care? Isn't it true that QAnon is less of a threat to America than the idea that we need liberal guardians to protect us from the crazies? So in other words, I guess, we're talking about how disinformation threatens our democracy, but can our reaction and worry about disinformation also be dangerous, I guess is.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things, and there's a lot to unpack in that question. But to start with, is the reaction perhaps too strong? I don't believe so. We're going to have QAnon members of Congress who are essentially running unopposed or not competitive districts who are then going to be making floor speeches based on this sort of rhetoric. That is frightening. I think that anytime we are QAnon, it really does undermine people's faith in democratic institutions. The idea that there's a deep state cabal funded by George Soros who is controlling everything that happens, I think it undermines a lot of the causes that we care about when it comes to being able to enable a healthy civic society. And I think that the other piece that really needs to be underscored when it comes to QAnon is it's a group that does have a tendency to result in violent events. So I think that we need to take those sorts of threats seriously. And I think even the FBI has identified QAnon as being a potential domestic terrorism threat. So I do think that we need to take it seriously. That said, I think that there are a lot of things that we could be doing to take it seriously that we're not. So The algorithmic page suggestions, that's still happening, and it's happening in more than just QAnon. Anecdotally, we saw it happening with Michigan militias, where if you were on a Michigan militia page, it recommended that you liked another Michigan militia. That's not something that we can just kind of brush off. We see the same thing with QAnon. And we are also starting to see an overlap, I would say, between people who are members of violent extremist groups and QAnon. So it's becoming, I think, a lot more fluid. And a lot of that has to do with the sheer numbers of people who are QAnon believers. It really is at this point statistics. But I think that we need to take this as a very serious threat to our ability to have civil discourse and a functioning democratic and capitalist society.
Angelo, I want to broaden this a little bit. A couple more questions here. So that sort of building off from QAnon to the broader issue, Richard Kahn asks, what should be the response to a First Amendment argument that restricting dissemination of this material or any material is censorship? So it's sort of the same question, but a little bit broader. And there's another question in there that's really about like, where's the line between disinformation and, violent disagreement? Like, we are in this incredibly polarized country. Some of the things that people on different sides of an issue believe feel like crazy, not worth platforming, but they're like truly somebody else's belief. So where's that line? And I think that relates to the First Amendment question. I don't know. It feels like there's probably a lot of consensus on this call that we don't want Holocaust denial out there. But after that, it gets trickier, right?
It does, and I think that these are always tough questions. I always start from when it comes down to where's the line with, well, is there a line right now, and if so, can we at least find one place where we can agree to draw it, and then we can always sort of work it backwards from there. And I think that there are things about QAnon in particular, and a lot of the disinformation that we talk about that is not ever considered to be protected or valuable speech. And that's never a part of our free speech dialogue, is that like all things are necessarily good. That's not true. That's why there are lawsuits for saying false claims about somebody that can hurt them reputationally, right? Now, not everybody can afford a lawyer to dig it down and usually can't recover, so most people don't sue. But the reality is, like, we already know this. We already recognize that not all speech is the same or good speech. And we don't want the government to be the one making that decision, but we all get to set those norms, because that's how we have to live with each other. And I think QAnon is a good place where you can draw that line, because it is fundamentally incompatible with society. And here's why. It's not a belief system in terms of political ideology. It is that you get to basically do anything to a person because, and this is important to consider, because they're not humans. The core part of people in QAnon believe that all these deep state operatives are doing it because they're interdimensional demons or psychic vampires. And therefore they are out there to destroy the world. And so when you hurt them or kill them, you're not killing a person, you're actually stopping a demon.
30 million people don't believe that, do they? 30 million.
I would say within the hardcore range of people, it's in the 18 to 30 million range that are full on QAnon believers. They either believe they're Satanists, deep state, they're psychic vampires, or interdimensional demons. Absolutely. Yeah. That's why it's so scary. And I would just say that it doesn't really penetrate the national dialogue, but a lot of the ways these things operate sort of start from false claims. So there was a donut shop out in Washington State where somebody fabricated a very elaborate hoax, similar to the one we saw in DC with Pizzagate, that they were perpetuating a child sex trafficking operation out of sort of a place where they store some of the ingredients. And it wasn't true at all. And it required law enforcement to intervene. What drives a lot of this isn't that the belief itself is bad, but the way that it foments is based off of straight fabrications that in any other world would be actionable. But just given the nature of online and just the reality of suing and litigation, you don't really have that recourse in this case. So the question is, what do you do when there's a systemic effort to sort of create that sort of amplify and boost what is otherwise in a one-to-one situation and in a very analog world would have easily been suable or would have been considered fighting words according to our Constitution.
It's interesting too, thinking back to what Molly said kind of at the top of the call about the perfect storm and mentioning the pandemic as well as other things. It's interesting when you describe like a whole lot of people possibly concentrated in certain areas who believe that the deep state is made up of non-human demons or whatever, you can understand then why it's very difficult for the government to have control of a public health crisis, right? And why when some officials say you need to get tests or wear masks or whatever, and then suddenly, you know, if there's so much, there's diving trust in media institutions, diving trust in government institutions, and so the ability to, at some point, it really starts to affect our ability to like function.
And then you also have people who are, you know, the snake oil salesman is an age-old kind of stereotype, but you have people who insert themselves into the narrative over coronavirus to profit off of this disinformation. People selling fake remedies, vitamin C drips. So just another issue to throw into the mix.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, we also have to consider that some of these for-profit disinformation outfits are actually making money off of the social media platforms. And I don't think that's something that frankly gets enough attention. And when we've exposed some of these for-profit disinformation networks, if they then lose their social media assets and they're losing the click-throughs and they're losing the revenue, we've seen them go out of business. So I think that we need to also be demanding that the platforms really get to know their customers and who they're paying the way that we have to anytime we hire a contractor or an employee.
So we're getting close to time, and I know most of us probably want to go prepare for the debate, but a couple more questions. So this is a basic one. Dan Friedman asks, is there a distinction between propaganda and disinformation? And, you know, there's all kinds of propaganda, right? Most politicians say some things that are at least only partly true, right? Or they're their version of the truth. So yeah, what's the distinction between when does propaganda become disinformation? Angelo?
Propaganda can use it, but it's I think of propaganda more like I think of marketing. It can be really insidious. It can be just, you know, good advertising and good messaging, and it's always in the details. And you know, I think increasingly we are seeing a landscape where, and that's I think the part about disinformation that disturbs me is when there's intentionality behind it. And then if you have a larger echo chamber or a larger algorithmic system that is designed to reinforce and boost that, are you sort of building a virtual propaganda operation simply by the rules of the algorithm? And that's where I think, you know, that intersects here, is, you know, disinformation can be a tactic of propaganda sometimes, and that's where it gets kind of scary.
Anyone else on that? Okay. Ryan, I think I'm going to end with this, although maybe we'll let everyone have a last word after this. But Ryan Dantas, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, he says, to steal a phrase from my middle school English teacher, this period in the US seems like the rising action of disinformation. And he's wondering what you think the climax will be and what might cause the falling action. So if you can think back to your middle school English classes where you were analyzing a story for rising action and falling action. I know, look, it's hard to predict, and things often get worse before they get better, but I would love it if each of you, we'll just do a round on this. What do you think is going to happen? What's going to happen next? What's the climax going to be, and what might cause the falling action? And you can sort of make this your last word. We'll start with you, Molly.
Oh, Jodi.
Sorry.
That's such a hard question.
You're the closest to middle school. No,
yeah,
sorry.
That's true. I guess that's true. I think that, you know, unfortunately, I think that this is nowhere near over. I wish that it was, but just spending time as I do in some, you know, extremist spaces on 4chan and other places on the internet, there is just, tension is running so high. I think that I actually don't think that, I think we're still in the rising action, as Ryan suggested. And I really don't know. I don't want to speculate, but I don't have a great feeling. I'll put it that way.
Maybe we're not even in the rising action. I don't remember what comes before the rising action, but.
Although actually one answer I will give is that I think that this period of time has put, you know, with work from the ADL and Media Matters and other people, has put intense pressure on social media companies. There's now a sense that Section 230, which shields them from a lot of liability in these matters, as Angelo was talking about, needs to be reformed. So I wonder if that'll end up being the climax, and the falling action will follow some reforms related to that.
I think a related question is, I mean, it relates to when you mentioned the Atlantic article. I mean, Trump will either win or lose. And that will have an effect, right? And I mean, I think we have a good sense of, if Trump stays in office, of the way that might continue some of the trends we've had for the last 4 years. I think that would be the best guess. If he loses, it's a little bit of anyone's guess, right, as to whether that cuts off a little bit of the source or there's so much backlash that it gets worse. I don't know. Lisa, where are you on the middle school literature analysis of what do you think about what might be the climax and what could bring about that falling action?
So, okay, so I keep in mind when I give this answer that I think about this all day long. And so I am hopefully skewed towards the most pessimistic side of the spectrum you could possibly be. I think we are going to get to a point where nobody trusts any information that they see. That is my kind of doomsday scenario. But I do think that a couple of things. I think that Europe is frankly the most likely to successfully regulate the platforms through the European Union. The UK is really out in front on this issue. I do not think that the United States will necessarily lead on legislation for a couple of reasons. I think we've been having the wrong conversation. I think we've been talking about disinformation as a political issue. We haven't actually talked very much about the campaign and what's happening around the campaigns this cycle. So we're getting there, but we're not there yet. We're still putting forward legislation around political advertisements, which are no longer the problem. I do think that we will get to a point, and what will ultimately save us is, yes, some sort of Section 230 reform, but also viewing disinformation as a consumer protection issue. I've started thinking about it, we are the ones who are targeted by disinformation. And so what recourse do we have if, what happens when your uncle doesn't wear a mask, doesn't think that they need to take preventative measures to protect themselves against coronavirus, lives in this echo chamber, and then gets sick and is stuck with these hospital bills. Like, I think we will get to a point where we're going to start viewing this more and more as a consumer protection issue versus anything else, because I think that is frankly the way we can get the most actionable.
I'm realizing that I feel like I had a little bit of a misfire of losing that conversation of what we can do. So I'm actually going to regroup. For those of you, most people have stuck around. We're going to I want everyone to actually have a word on really help us think about what is a really concrete thing that an individual person who might be very freaked out by this conversation, although you guys have all been incredibly smart and insightful and helpful in understanding what's going on. It is scary out there. So what is something that we can do to combat disinformation, ferret it out, help Uncle Joe get out of QAnon, whatever? Pick one of those things. We'll start with you, Angelo. One concrete thing we can do.
The simplest thing is that, as much cheating happens and as much of a threat disinformation is, and these are all real things, and as much as the platforms are terrible, and they have been and probably will be for a while longer, the one thing that we can control is what we do. And aside from all the advantages that they have, the one thing that really does propel a lot of these conspiracy theories, these attacks, these extremist efforts, is that the right in particular has this amplification imperative. They not just amplify misinformation, but they evangelize their ideas. And one of the effects of that has been to sort of neutralize our own participation. People duck and cover. That in turn weights the algorithm. It shapes what other people in your network see. When you don't talk about something, it tells Facebook and other platforms that thing is not relevant to you and people like you. And that's important. And there are real significant effects of us not engaging. So what I would say is, you don't have to become a bot hunter. You don't have to spend your day trying to sniff out disinformation or persuading the most diehard crazy uncle or relative. All you simply have to do is to talk about the things that are relevant to you. It's not just about sharing the links, but to do it. That informs the algorithm. And it's just like, I use the rule like when you're on a crowded train or an elevator, everything is norms. And this is what this is too. And the way that we help shape and enforce those norms is what you say in your own social feeds right now and in your own offline bubbles. And that alone is the single biggest thing that if we all did more of that, it would balance it out. What we're seeing is an increasing polarization, which is obviously advantaging one set of extremes right now.
If you're looking for stuff to share, feel free to share any forward articles. They're all excellent. Oren, what's one thing we can do?
Sure. So this is a legacy of struggle. I'm not trying to get like biblical here, but we struggle against tyranny, century after century. We struggle against bigotry and hatred. And so for the rest of our lives, we're going to struggle against disinformation. And that's going to be a fight that is going to give us purpose, and it's going to be exciting, and it's going to be sad sometimes. But this is what we do when we fight against things that need to be fought against. And what we can do to make sure that that legacy continues is at a young age, provide critical thinking skills, provide the values so that the struggle will continue. It'll wane, it'll go up and down, but with time, the truth will reveal itself. And so that's why I'm at ADL as long as I am, and I actually really believe it.
That's great. Thank you. Molly?
I spoke to an expert a couple of weeks ago for Fahrenheit 411 who said that it's not about each individual disinformation item, but it's about the narrative on the whole, which is targeting a specific fear. So if I were trying to convert a person who had gone down the rabbit hole of extremism back to society, essentially, I would try and understand what fear had been targeted and aim to reassure them on that fear. That was the advice that was offered by an expert that I spoke to.
That's good. And Lisa, what's one thing we can do?
So I'm going to do two things, but I'm going to keep it really brief. So the first is don't engage in the sense that do not share disinformation because somebody out there trusts you. And if you share something that's not true, even unintentionally, it will unfortunately make the situation worse. So only share sources of accurate information and those who are qualified to be able to comment on the topic at hand. For example, unless you're an epidemiologist, stay out of how coronavirus spreads unless you know for sure. The other thing that I'm going to say is going to seem counterintuitive to that point, which is we have to engage because somebody trusts you. So going back to everybody's point, really, we all need to do our part in being able to, help bring back others who may have started to go down that rabbit hole, because you are going to be positioned to be able to help somebody see that they maybe shouldn't believe in QAnon. Maybe there isn't a deep state cabal. And being able to have that human to human interaction is going to, we're all doing our part. We're all one small piece of the puzzle. But if everybody is able to bring somebody back, then maybe we've solved the problem.
Great. Thank you guys so much. And I want to thank our team at The Forward, Mira Fox, who's hosting this webinar, Lisa Lepson, Dina Cooperman, who helped put it together, and especially today, Lori Moskowitz and Stacy Burdett, who really helped get this panel together, promote it, frame it. I so appreciate your help and your partnership. And thank you to our wonderful panelists, Molly Boigon, Lisa Kaplan, Angelo Carusone, and Oren Segal. Thank you all for being with us. I forgot to mention that you'll also get in your email a discount subscription offer for participating in this Zoominar, and please watch your email for more great events. We have one coming up on Monday about social cohesion and how the crises of 2020 have really divided us and what we can do to combat that. We have one coming up later next week, 25 years after the Rabin assassination, what is the state and the health of Israeli democracy? We're always open to ideas, so if you want to see a topic, let us know. Enjoy the debate. It's not too early to say Shabbat Shalom, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.